Who could be surprised if, in these circumstances, he refused to return to court? He declined to be insulted. If the Queen really wished to see him, let her make such an eventuality impossible. Let her show the world by some signal mark of her favour that his position, so far from being weakened by the island's voyage, was more firmly established than ever. It was announced that he was still far from well, that any movement from Wanstead was out of the question. Elizabeth lowered. Her accession day, November the 17th, was approaching, and the customary celebrations would lack something. Decidedly they would lack something in the absence of... But she refused to think of it. She grew restless, and a thunderstorm seemed to hang over the court. The return of Essex was becoming of the highest importance to everybody. Lord Hunsdon addressed the Earl with a tactful remonstrance, but in vain. Then Burghley wrote, not without humour. "By report," he said, "I hear that your lordship is very sick, though, I trust, recoverable with warm diet." But accession day came and went without the presence of Essex. Burghley wrote again. Even Nottingham sent a fine Elizabethan letter, protesting his friendship. He doubted that some villainous device had been pursued to make your lordship conceive ill of me. But, my lord, if I have not dealt in all things concerning you, as I would have dealt with all had I been in your place, let me never enjoy the kingdom of heaven. Under this fusillade, Essex weakened so far as to be let it known that he would return, if Her Majesty expressly required it. And then Elizabeth mounted her high horse. She would mention the matter no more. She had other things to think of. She must give the whole of her attention to the negotiations with the French ambassador. The French ambassador did indeed require skilful handling. A new diplomatic situation was arising, so full of uncertainty that Elizabeth found it more difficult than ever to decide upon the course to take. King Philip had unexpectedly recovered after the return of his fleet to Ferrol. He had sent for the Adelantado, who, it was expected by the courtiers, would leave the king's presence for the gallows. But not at all. The interview was entirely devoted to a discussion of the forthcoming invasion of England, which was to take place in the spring. There was to be a fourth armada. Extraordinary efforts were to be made. The deficiencies of the past were to be rectified, and this time there would be no doubt of the result. A state paper was drawn up to determine the steps which must be taken to ensure the success of the expedition. "The first," so ran this remarkable document, "is to recommend the undertaking to God, and to endeavour to amend our sins. But, since His Majesty has already given a general order to this effect, and has appointed a commander who usually insists upon this point, it will only be needful to take care that the order is obeyed, and to promulgate it again. In the next place, a large sum of money must be raised, with extraordinary rapidity and by every licit means that can be devised. In order to examine what means are licit, a committee of theologians must be summoned, to whom so great a matter may be confided, and their opinion should be adopted. Certainly, with such wisdom at the head of affairs, there could be no possible doubt whatever about the success of the scheme. But, while the attack on England was maturing, King Philip was growing more and more anxious for peace with France. Henry IV was gradually establishing his position, and when he captured Amiens, the moment for opening negotiations had come. The French king, on his side, wished for peace. He saw that he could obtain it, but before coming to a conclusion it was necessary to consult his two allies, the English and the Dutch. He hoped to persuade them to a general pacification, and with this end in view he dispatched a special envoy, de Maze, to London. If de Maze expected to extract a speedy reply to his proposals, he was doomed to disappointment. He was received at the English court with respect and cordiality, but as his questions grew more definite, the replies to them grew more vague. He had several interviews with Elizabeth, and the oracle was not, indeed, dumb. On the contrary, it was extremely talkative upon every subject but the one in hand. The ambassador was perplexed, amazed, and fascinated, while the Queen rambled on from topic to topic, from music to religion, from dancing to Essex, from the state of Christendom to her own accomplishments. She touched upon King Philip, who, she said, had tried to have her murdered 15 times. "How the man must love me," she added, with a laugh and a sigh. She regretted these fatal differences in religion, which, she considered, mostly turned upon bagatelles. She quoted Horace, "Quidquid delirant reges, plectuncta archivi." Yes, it was all too true. Her people were suffering, and she loved her people, and her people loved her. She would rather die than diminish by 1 iota that mutual affection, and yet it could not last much longer, for she was on the brink of the grave. Then, before de Mace could get in a word of expostulation, "No, no," she exclaimed, "I don't think I shall die as soon as all that. I am not so old, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, as you suppose." The Queen's costumes were a source of perpetual astonishment to de Mace, and he constantly took note of them in his journal. He learned that she had never parted with a dress in the course of her life, and that about 3,000 hung in her wardrobes. On one occasion he experienced something more than astonishment. Summoned to an audience, he found Elizabeth standing near a window in most unusual attire. Her black taffeta dress was cut in the Italian fashion and ornamented with broad gold bands. The sleeves were open and lined with crimson. Below this dress, which was open all down the front, was another of white damask, open also down to the waist, and below that again was a white chemise, also open. The amazed ambassador hardly knew where to look. Whenever he glanced at the Queen, he seemed to see far too much, and his embarrassment was still further increased by the deliberation with which, from time to time, throwing back her head as she talked, she took the folds of her dress in her hands and held them apart, so that, as he described it, "lui voit-on tout l'estomac jusqu'au nombril." The costume was completed by a red wig, which fell onto her shoulders and was covered with magnificent pearls, while strings of pearls were twisted round her arms, and her wrists were covered with jewelled bracelets. Sitting down when he appeared, she discoursed for several hours with the utmost amiability. The Frenchman was convinced that she was trying to bewitch him. Perhaps she was, or perhaps the unaccountable woman had merely been feeling a little vague and fantastic that morning when she put on her clothes. The absence of Essex dominated the domestic situation, and de Mace was not slow to perceive a state of tension in the atmosphere. The great Earl, hovering on the outskirts of London in self-imposed and ambiguous exile, filled every mind with fears, hopes, and calculations. The Queen's references to the subject, though apparently outspoken, were not illuminating. She assured the ambassador that if Essex had really failed in his duty during the island's voyage, she would have cut off his head, but that she had gone into the question very thoroughly and come to the conclusion that he was blameless. She appeared to be calm. Her allusion to the Earl's execution seemed to be a piece of half-jocular bravado, and she immediately passed on to other matters. The courtiers were more agitated. There were strange rumours abroad. It was whispered that the Earl had announced his approaching departure for the West, and had declared that so many gentlemen were with him who had been ill recompensed for their services that it would be dangerous to stay any longer near London. The rash remark was repeated everywhere by Essex's enemies, but it had no sequel, and he remained at Wanstead. All through the month of December, While de Mace was struggling to obtain some categorical pronouncement from Elizabeth, this muffled storm continued. At one moment Essex suggested that his difference with Nottingham might be settled by single combat, a proposal that, curiously enough, was not accepted. Nottingham himself grew testy, took to his bed and talked of going into the country. At last, quite unexpectedly, Essex appeared at court. It was instantly known that he had triumphed. On the 28th, the Queen made him Earl Marshal of England. The office had been in abeyance for many years, and its revival and bestowal at this moment was indeed a remarkable sign of the royal favour, for the appointment automatically restored the precedency of Essex over Nottingham. Since the offices of Lord Admiral and Earl Marshal were by statute of equal rank, and since both were held by earls, it followed that the first place belonged to him of the older creation. A few days later, de Mace prepared to depart, having achieved nothing by his mission. He paid a visit of farewell to Essex, who received him with sombre courtesy. A great cloud, said the Earl, had been hanging over his head, though now it was melting away. He did not believe in the possibility of peace between Spain and England, but he was unwilling to take a part in those negotiations. It was useless. The father and the son alone were listened to. Then he paused and added gloomily, "The court is prey to two evils, delay and inconsistency, and the cause is the sex of the sovereign." De Mace, inwardly noting the curious combination of depression, anger, and ambition, respectfully withdrew. The Earl might still be surly, but the highest of spirits possessed Elizabeth. The cruel suspense of the last 2 months, the longest and most anxious of those wretched separations, was over. Essex was back again. A new delightful zest came bursting into existence. France could wait. She would send Robert Cecil to talk to Henry. In the meantime, she looked gaily round for some object on which to vent her energy. Yes, there was James of Scotland. That ridiculous young man had been up to his tricks again, but she would give him a lesson. It had come to her ears that he was actually sending out an envoy to the courts of the Continent to assert his right of succession to the English throne. His right of succession. It was positively a mania. He seemed to think she was already dead, but he would find he was mistaken. Lashing herself into a most exhilarating fury, she seized her pen and wrote a letter to her brother of Scotland, well calculated to make him shake in his shoes. "When the first blast," she began, "of strange, unused, and seld heard of sounds had pierced my ears, I supposed that flying Fame, who with swift quills oft passeth with the worst, had brought report of some untruth. But it was not so. I am sorry," she continued, "that you have so wilfully fallen from your best stay, and will needs throw yourself into the whirlpool of bottomless discredit. Was the haste so great to hie to such opprobry? I see well we two be of very different natures. Shall embassage be sent to foreign princes laden with instructions of your rash advised charge? I assure you the travail of your creased words shall pass the bounds of too many lands with an imputation of such levity as when the true sunshine of my sincere dealing and extraordinary care ever for your safety and honour shall overshade too far the dim and misty crowds of false invectives. And be assured that you deal with such a king as will bear no wrongs and endure no infamy. The examples have been so lately seen as they can hardly be forgotten, of a far mightier and potenter prince than many Europe hath. Look you not, therefore, without large amends I may or will slupper up such indignities, and so I recommend you to a better mind and more advised conclusions." Having polished off King James, she felt able to cope once more with King Henry. She told Robert Cecil that he should go to France as her special ambassador, and the secretary was all assent and gratitude. Inwardly, however, he was uneasy. He did not relish the thought of a long absence abroad while the Earl remained at home in possession of the field, and, while he gravely sat over his dispatches, he wondered what could be done. He decided to be perfectly open, to approach his rival with a frank avowal of his anxieties. The plan worked, and Essex, in generous grandeur, remembering with a smile how, in his absence, both the secretaryship and the Duchy of Lancaster had gone to Cecil, swore that he would steal no marches. Yet Cecil still felt uncomfortable. It happened that at that moment a large and valuable consignment of cochineal arrived from the Indies for the Queen. He suggested that Essex should be allowed the whole for £50,000, at the rate of 18 shillings a pound, the market price of a pound of cochineal being between 30 and 40 shillings. And he also recommended that Essex should be given £7,000 worth of the precious substance as a free gift. Elizabeth readily consented, and the Earl found himself bound to the secretary by something more than airy chivalry, by ties of gratitude for a very solid benefit. Cecil had taken ship for France when news of a most alarming nature reached London. A Spanish fleet of 38 flyboats with 5,000 soldiers on board was sailing up the Channel. Elizabeth's first thought was for her secretary. She sent an urgent message, forbidding him to leave England, but he had already sailed, had missed the Spanish fleet, and arrived at Dieppe in safety. From there he at once dispatched to his father a full account of the enemy's armament, writing on the cover of his letter, for life, for very life," with a drawing of a gallows as a hint to the messenger of what would happen to him if he dallied on the road. There was not a moment's hesitation in London. The consultations of the government were brief and to the point. Orders were sent out in every direction, and no one asked the advice of the theologians. Lord Cumberland, with all the ships he could collect, was told to pursue the enemy. Lord Nottingham hurried to Gravesend, and Lord Cobham to Dover. Raleigh was commissioned to furnish provisions all along the coast. Essex was to stand ready to repel an attack wherever it might be delivered. But the alarm passed as quickly as it had arisen. Cumberland's squadron found the Spaniards outside Calais and sank 18 of the flyboats, the rest of them huddled into the harbour, from which they never ventured to emerge. Essex kept his promise. During the secretary's absence he supplied his place with the Queen, but made no attempt to take an unfair advantage of the situation. For the time, indeed, his interests seemed to be elsewhere, and politics gave way to love-making. During the early wintry months of 1598 he kept himself warm at court, philandering with the ladies. The rumours of his proceedings were many and scandalous. It was known that he had had a child by Mistress Elizabeth Southwell. He was suspected of a passion for Lady Mary Howard, and of another for Mistress Russell. A court gossip reported it as certain that his fairest Bridges had once more captured the Earl's heart. While he passed the time with plays and banquets, both Lady Essex and the Queen were filled with uneasiness. Elizabeth's high spirits had suddenly collapsed. Neither the state of Europe nor the state of Whitehall gave her any satisfaction. She grew moody, suspicious, and violent. For the slightest neglect she railed against her maids of honour until they burst out crying. She believed that she had detected love-looks between Essex and Lady Mary Howard, and could hardly control her anger. She did, however, for the moment, privately determining to have her revenge before long. Her opportunity came when Lady Mary appeared one day in a particularly handsome velvet dress, with a rich border powdered with pearl and gold. Her Majesty said nothing, but next morning she had the dress secretly abstracted from Lady Mary's wardrobe and brought to her. That evening she electrified the court by stalking in with Lady Mary's dress upon her. The effect was grotesque. She was far taller than Lady Mary, and the dress was not nearly long enough. "Well, ladies," she said, "how do you like my new fancied suit?" Then, amid the gasping silence, she bore down upon Lady Mary. "Ah, my lady, and what think you? Is not this dress too short and ill-becoming?" The unfortunate girl stammered out an assent. "Why then," cried her Majesty, "if it become not me as being too short, I am minded it shall never become thee as being too fine, so it fitteth neither well," and she marched out of the room again. Such moments were disturbing, but Essex still had the art to pacify the royal agitations. Then all was radiance again, and spring was to be seen approaching, and one could forget the perplexities of passion and politics, and one could be careless and gay. In a particularly yielding moment the Earl had persuaded the Queen to grant him a great favour. She had agreed to see his mother, the odious Lettice Leicester, who had been banished from her presence for years. Yet when it came to the point, Elizabeth jibbed. Time after time Lady Leicester was brought to the Privy Gallery. There she stood waiting for Her Majesty to pass, but, for some reason or other, Her Majesty always went out by another way. At last it was arranged that Lady Chandos should be given a great dinner, at which the Queen and Lady Leicester should meet. Everything was ready. The royal coach was waiting. Lady Leicester stood at the entrance with a fair jewel in her hand worth £300. But the Queen sent word that she should not go. Essex, who had been ill all day, got out of bed when he heard what had happened, put on a dressing-gown, and had himself conveyed to the Queen by a back way. It was all useless. The Queen would not move, and Lady Chandos's dinner party was indefinitely postponed. Then, all at once, Elizabeth relented. Lady Leicester was allowed to come to court. She appeared before the Queen, kissed her hand, kissed her breast, embraced her, and was kissed in return. The reconciliation was a very pretty one, but how long would these fair days last? In the meantime, Cecil had failed as completely in France as de Mace in England. He returned, having accomplished nothing, and early in May the inevitable happened. Henry broke off from his allies, and by the Treaty of Vervins made peace with Spain. Elizabeth's comments were far from temperate. The French king, she said, was the Antichrist of ingratitude. She had helped him to his crown, and now he had deserted her. It was true enough, but the wily Bernays, like everybody else, was playing his own game. Burghley, however, was convinced that the situation required something more than vituperative outbursts. He wished for peace, and believed that it was still not too late to follow Henry's example. Philip, he thought, would be ready enough to agree to reasonable terms. Such were Burghley's views, and Essex violently opposed them. He urged an exactly contrary policy, a vigorous offensive, a great military effort which would bring Spain to her knees. To start off with, he proposed an immediate attack upon the Indies, whereupon Burghley made a mild allusion to the islands voyage. And so began once more a long, fierce struggle between the Earl and the Cecils, a struggle that turned the council board into a field of battle, where the issues of peace and war, the destinies of England, and the ambitions of hostile ministers jostled and hurtled together, while the Queen sat in her high chair at the head of the table, listening, approving, fiercely disagreeing, veering passionately from one side to the other, and never making up her mind. Week after week the fight went on. Essex's strong card was Holland. Were we, he asked, to play the same trick on the Dutch as Henry had played on us? Were we to leave our Protestant allies to the tender mercy of the Spaniard? Burghley replied that the Dutch might join in a general pacification, and he countered Holland with Ireland. He pointed out that the only hope of effectually putting a stop to the running sore of Irish rebellion, which was draining the resources of England, was to make peace with Spain, whereby the rebels would be deprived of Spanish money and reinforcements, while at the same time England would be able to devote all her energies to a thorough conquest of the country. Current events gave weight to his words. The Lord Deputy Borough had suddenly died. There was confusion in Dublin, and Tyrone, the leader of the rebels in Ulster, had, after a patched-up truce, reopened hostilities. In June it was known that he was laying siege to the fort on the river Blackwater, one of the principal English strongholds in the north of Ireland, and that the garrison was in difficulties. No new Lord Deputy had been appointed. Who should be selected for that most difficult post? Elizabeth, gravely troubled, found it impossible to decide. It looked as if the Irish question was soon to become as intolerable as the Spanish one. As the summer days grew hotter, the discussions in the council grew hotter too. There were angry explosions on either side. One day, after Essex had delivered a feverish harangue on his favourite topic, the infamy of a peace with Spain, Burley drew out a prayer book from his pocket and pointed with trembling finger to a passage in the 55th Psalm. "Bloodthirsty and deceitful men," read Essex, "will not live out half their days." He furiously brushed aside the imputation, but everyone was deeply impressed, and there were some who recollected afterwards with awe and wonder the prophetic text of the old Lord Treasurer. Essex felt that he was misunderstood, and composed a pamphlet to explain his views. It was a gallantly written work, but it convinced no one who was not convinced already. As for the Queen, she still wavered. The Dutch sent an embassy, offering large sums of money if she would continue the war. This was important, and she appeared to be coming round finally to an anti-Spanish policy, but it was appearance and nothing more. She sheered away again with utter indecision. Nerves grew jangled and tempers dangerously short. Everything, it was clear, was working up towards one of those alarming climaxes with which all at court had grown so familiar, and while they waited in dread, sure enough, the climax came. But this time it was of a nature undreamt of by the imagination of any courtier. When the incredible story reached them, it was as if the earth had opened at their feet. The question of the Irish appointment had become pressing, and Elizabeth, feeling that something really must be done about it, kept reverting to the subject on every possible occasion, without any result. At last she thought she had decided that Sir William Knollys, Essex's uncle, was the man. She was in the council chamber with Essex, the Lord Admiral, Robert Cecil, and Thomas Windbank, clerk of the signet, when she mentioned this. As often happened, they were all standing up. Essex, who did not want to lose the support of his uncle at court, proposed instead Sir George Carew, a follower of the Cecils, whose absence in Ireland would, he thought, inconvenience the secretary. The Queen would not hear of it, but Essex persisted. Each was annoyed. They pressed their candidates. Their words grew high and loud, and at last the Queen roundly declared that, say what he would, Knollys should go. Essex, overcome with irritation, contemptuous in look and gesture, turned his back upon her. She instantly boxed his ears. "Go to the devil!" she cried, flaring with anger. And then the impossible happened. The mad young man completely lost his temper, and with a resounding oath clapped his hand to his sword. "This is an outrage," he shouted in his sovereign's face, "that I will not put up with. I would not have borne it from your father's hands." He was interrupted by Nottingham, who pressed him backwards. Elizabeth did not stir. There was an appalling silence, and he rushed from the room. Unparalleled as was the conduct of Essex, there was yet another surprise in store for the court, for the Queen's behaviour was no less extraordinary. She did nothing. The Tower, the block, heaven knows what exemplary punishment might naturally have been expected, but nothing happened at all. Essex vanished into the country, and the Queen, wrapped in impenetrable mystery, proceeded with her usual routine of work and recreation. What was passing in her head? Had she been horrified into a paralysis? Was she overcome by the workings of outraged passion? Was she biding her time for some terrific revenge? It was impossible to guess. She swept on her way until there was indeed an interruption. The great, the inevitable misfortune had come at last. Burley was dying. Worn out by old age, the gout, and the cares of his great office, he was sinking rapidly to the grave. He had been her most trusted counsellor for more than 40 years, from a time, how unbelievably distant, when she had not been Queen of England. Her spirit, she had always called him, and now her spirit was leaving her forever. She could attend to nothing else. She hoped against hope, she prayed, she visited him constantly, waiting with grand affection, the solicitude of some strange old fairy daughter, beside his dying bed. Sir Robert sent him game, but he was too feeble to lift the food to his mouth, and the Queen fed him herself. "I pray you," he wrote to his son, "diligently and effectually let Her Majesty understand how her singular kindness doth overcome my power to acquit it, who, though she will not be a mother, yet showeth herself, by feeding me with her own princely hand, as a careful Norris, and if I may be weaned to feed myself, I shall be more ready to serve her on the earth. If not, I hope to be, in heaven, a servitor for her and God's church, and so I thank you for your partridges." When all was over, Elizabeth wept long and bitterly, and her tears were still flowing. It was but 10 days after Burley's death, when yet another calamity fell upon her. There had been a terrible disaster in Ireland. Sir Henry Bagnall, marching at the head of a powerful army to the relief of the fort on the Blackwater, had been attacked by Tyrone. His army had been annihilated, and he himself killed. The whole of Northern Ireland, as far as the walls of Dublin, lay open to the rebels. It was the most serious reverse that Elizabeth had suffered in the whole of her reign. The news was quickly carried to Whitehall. It was also carried to the Escurial. King Philip's agony was coming to an end at last. The ravages of his dreadful diseases had overwhelmed him utterly. Covered from head to foot with putrefying sores, he lay moribund in indescribable torment. His bed had been lifted into the oratory, so that his dying eyes might rest till the last moment on the high altar in the great church. He was surrounded by monks, priests, prayers, chanting, and holy relics. For 50 days and nights the extraordinary scene went on. He was dying as he had lived, in absolute piety. His conscience was clear. He had always done his duty. He had been infinitely industrious. He had existed solely for virtue and the glory of God. One thought alone troubled him. Had he been remiss in the burning of heretics? He had burnt many, no doubt, but he might have burnt more. Was it because of this, perhaps, that he had not been quite as successful as he might have wished? It was certainly mysterious. He could not understand it. There seemed to be something wrong with his empire. There was never enough money. The Dutch, the Queen of England. As he mused, a paper was brought in. It was the dispatch from Ireland announcing the victory of Tyrone. He sank back on his pillows, radiant. All was well. His prayers and his virtues had been rewarded, and the tide had turned at last. He dictated a letter to Tyrone of congratulation and encouragement. He promised immediate succor. He foretold the destruction of the heretics and the ruin of the heretic queen. A fifth armada. He could dictate no more, and sank into a tortured stupor. When he awoke, it was night, and they were singing at the altar below him. A sacred candle was lighted and put into his hand. The flame, as he clutched it closer and closer, casting lurid shadows upon his face. And so, in ecstasy and in torment, in absurdity and in greatness, happy, miserable, horrible, and holy, King Philip went off to meet the Trinity. 11. Essex had gone away to Wanstead, where he remained in a disturbed, uncertain, and unhappy condition. The alternating contradictions in his state of mind grew more extreme than ever. There were moments when he felt that he must fling himself at the feet of his mistress, that, come what might, he must regain her affection, her companionship, and all the sweets of the position that had so long been his. He could not, he would not, think that he had been in the wrong. She had treated him with an indignity that was unbearable, and then, as he brooded over what had happened, anger flamed up in his heart. He would tell her what he thought of her. Had he not always done so, ever since that evening, more than 10 years ago, when he had chided her so passionately, with Raleigh standing at the door? He would chide her now, no less passionately, but, as was fitting, in a deeper and a sadder tone. "Madam," he wrote, "when I think how I have preferred your beauty above all things, and received no pleasure in life but by the increase of your favour towards me, I wonder at myself what cause there could be to make me absent myself one day from you. But when I remember that your Majesty hath, by the intolerable wrong you have done both me and yourself, not only broken all laws of affection, but done against the honour of your sex, I think all places better than that where I am, and all dangers well undertaken, so I might retire myself from the memory of my false, inconstant, and beguiling pleasures. I was never proud till your Majesty sought to make me too base. And now, since my destiny is no better, my despair shall be as my love was, without repentance. I must commend my faith to be judged by him who judgeth all hearts, since on earth I find no right. Wishing your Majesty all comforts and joy in the world, and no greater punishment for your wrongs to me than to know the faith of him you have lost, and the baseness of those you shall keep. Your Majesty's most humble servant, R. Essex." When the news of the disaster on the Blackwater reached him, he sent another letter, offering his services, and hurried to Whitehall. He was not admitted. "He hath played long enough upon me," Elizabeth was heard to remark, "and now I mean to play a while upon him, and stand as much upon my greatness as he hath upon stomach." He wrote a long letter of expostulation, with quotations from Horace and vows of duty. "I stay in this place for no other purpose but to attend your commandment." She sent him a verbal message in reply. "Tell the Earl that I value myself at as great a price as he values himself." He wrote again, "I do confess that, as a man, I have been more subject to your natural beauty than as a subject to the power of a king." He obtained an interview. The Queen was not ungracious. The onlookers supposed that all was well again. But it was not, and he returned to Wanstead in darker dudgeon than ever. It was clear that what Elizabeth was waiting for was some apology. Since this was not forthcoming, a deadlock had apparently been reached, and it seemed to the moderate men at court that it was time an effort should be made to induce the Earl to realize the essence of the situation. The Lord Keeper Egerton, therefore, composed an elaborate appeal. Did not Essex understand, he asked, that his present course was full of danger? Did he not see that he was encouraging his enemies? Had he forgotten his friends? Had he forgotten his country? There was only one thing to do. He must beg for the Queen's forgiveness. Whether he was right or wrong could make no difference. Have you given cause, and yet take scandal to yourself? Why, then, all you can do is too little to give satisfaction. Is cause of scandal given to you? Let policy, duty, and religion enforce you to yield and submit to your sovereign, between whom and you there can be no proportion of duty. The difficulty, my good lord, Egerton concluded, is to conquer yourself, which is the height of all true valour and fortitude, whereunto all your honourable actions have tended. Do it in this, and God will be pleased, Her Majesty well satisfied. Your country will take good, and your friends comfort by it. Yourself shall receive honour, and your enemies, if you have any, shall be disappointed in their bitter-sweet hope. Essex's reply was most remarkable. In a style no less elaborate than the Lord Keeper's, he rebutted all his arguments. He denied that he was doing wrong either to himself or his friends. The Queen's conduct, he said, made it impossible for him to act in any other way. How could he serve his country when she had driven him into a private kind of life, when she had dismissed, discharged, and disabled him? The indissoluble duty, he continued, which I owe to Her Majesty is only the duty of allegiance, which I never will, nor never can, fail in. The duty of attendance is no indissoluble duty. I owe to Her Majesty the duty of an Earl and Lord Marshal of England. I have been content to do Her Majesty the service of a clerk, but can never serve her as a villain or a slave. As he wrote, he grew warmer. But, say you, I must yield and submit. I can neither yield myself to be guilty, or this imputation laid upon me to be just. Have I given cause, ask you, and take scandal when I have done? No, I give no cause. I patiently bear all, and sensibly feel all that I then received when this scandal was given me. Nay, more. And now he could hold himself in no longer. When the vilest of all indignities are done unto me, doth religion enforce me to sue? The whole heat of his indignation was flaring out. Doth God require it? Is it impiety not to do it? What, cannot princes err? Cannot subjects receive wrong? Is an earthly power or authority infinite? Pardon me, my good lord, I can never subscribe to these principles. Let Solomon's fool laugh when he is stricken. Let those that mean to make their profit of princes show to have no sense of princes' injuries. Let them acknowledge an infinite absoluteness on earth, that do not believe in an absolute infiniteness in heaven. As for me, I have received wrong and feel it. My cause is good, I know it, and whatsoever come, all the powers on earth can never show more strength and constancy in opposing than I can show in suffering whatsoever can or shall be imposed upon me. Magnificent words, certainly, but dangerous, portentous, and not wise. What good could come of flaunting republican sentiments under the calm nose of a Tudor? Such oratory was too early or too late. Hampden would have echoed it, but in truth it was the past rather than the future that was speaking with the angry pen of Robert Devereux. The blood of 100 barons who had paid small heed to the Lord's anointed was pulsing in his heart. Yes, if it was a question of birth, why should the heir of the ancient aristocracy of England bow down before the descendant of some bishop's butler in Wales? Such were his wild feelings, the last extravagance of the Middle Ages flickering through the high Renaissance nobleman. The facts vanished. His outraged imagination preferred to do away with them. For after all, what had actually happened? Simply this: he had been rude to an old lady, who was also a queen, and had had his ears boxed. There were no principles involved, and there was no oppression. It was merely a matter of bad temper and personal pique. A realistic observer would have seen that in truth there were only two alternatives for one in Essex's position: a graceful apology, followed by a genuine reconciliation with the Queen, or else a complete and final retirement from public life. A realistic observer would have seen that in truth there were only two alternatives for one in Essex's position: a graceful apology, followed by a genuine reconciliation with the Queen, or else a complete and final retirement from public life. More than once his mind swayed, as so often before, towards the latter solution. But he was not a realist, he was a romantic, passionate, restless, confused, and he shut his eyes to what was obvious, that, as things stood, if he could not bring himself to be one of those who make their profit of princes, he must indeed make up his mind to a life of books and hunting at Chartley. Nor were those who surrounded him any more realistic than himself. Francis Bacon had for many months past avoided his company. Antony was an enthusiastic devotee. Henry Cuff was rash and cynical. His sisters were too ambitious. His mother was too much biased by her lifelong quarrel with Elizabeth to act as a restraining force. Two other followers completed his intimate domestic circle. His mother's husband, for Lady Leicester had married a third time, was Sir Christopher Blount. A sturdy soldier and a Roman Catholic, he had served his stepson faithfully for many years, and, it was clear, would continue to do so, whatever happened to the end. More dubious, from every point of view, was the position of Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy. The tall young man with the brown hair and the beautiful complexion, who had won Elizabeth's favour by his feats at tilting, and who had fought a duel with Essex over the golden chessmen given him by the Queen, had grown and prospered with the years. The death of his elder brother had brought him the family peerage. He had distinguished himself as Essex's lieutenant in all his expeditions, and he had never lost the favour of Elizabeth. But he was united to Essex by something more than a common military service, by a singular romance. The Earl's favourite sister, Lady Penelope, had been the Stella Sir Philip Sidney had vainly loved. She had married Lord Rich, while Sidney had married Walsingham's daughter, who, on Sir Philip's death, had become the wife of Essex. Penelope had not been happy. Lord Rich was an odious husband, and she had fallen in love with Lord Mountjoy. A liaison sprang up, a lifelong liaison, one of those indisputable and yet ambiguous connections which are at once recognized and ignored by society, between Essex's friend and Essex's sister. Thus Mountjoy, doubly bound to the Earl, had become, or so it seemed, the most faithful of his adherents. The little group, Essex, Lady Essex, Mountjoy, and Penelope Rich, was held together by the deepest feelings of desire and affection, while behind and above them all there hovered in sainted knightliness the shade of Sir Philip Sidney. And so there was no barrier to hold Essex back from folly and intemperance. On the contrary, the characteristics of his environment, personal devotion, family pride, and military zeal, all conspired to urge him on. More remote influences worked in the same direction. Throughout the country, the Earl's popularity was a growing force. The reasons for this were vague, but none the less effectual. His gallant figure had taken hold of the popular imagination. He was generous and courteous. He was the enemy of Raleigh, who was everywhere disliked, and now he was out of favour and seemed to be hardly used. The puritanical city of London, especially, tending as it always did to be hostile to the court, paid an incongruous devotion to the unregenerate Earl. The word went round that he was a pillar of Protestantism, and Essex, who was ready enough to be all things to all men, was not unwilling to accept the role. Evidence of another kind of esteem appeared when, on the death of Burghley, the University of Cambridge at once elected him to fill the vacant place of Chancellor. He was delighted by the compliment, and as a mark of gratitude presented the University with a silver cup of rare design. The curious goblet still stands on the table of the Vice-Chancellor, to remind the passing generations of Englishmen at once of the tumult of the past and of the placid continuity of their history. Egged on by private passion and public favour, the headstrong man gave vent in moments of elation to strange expressions of anger and revolt. Sir Christopher Blount was present at Wanstead when one of these explosions occurred, and though his stepson's words were whirling and indefinite, they revealed to him with startling vividness a state of mind that was full, as he said afterwards, of dangerous discontentment. But the moments of elation passed, to be succeeded by gloom and hesitation. What was to be done? There was no satisfaction anywhere. Retirement, submission, defiance, each was more wretched than the others, and the Queen still made no sign. In reality, of course, Elizabeth too was wavering. She kept up a bold front. She assured everybody, including herself, that this time she was really going to be firm, but she knew well enough how many times before she had yielded in like circumstances, and experience indicated that the future would resemble the past. As usual, the withdrawal of that radiant presence was becoming insupportable. She thought of Wanstead, so near, so far, and almost capitulated. Yet no, she would do nothing. She would go on waiting, only a little longer, perhaps, and the capitulation would come from the other side. And then one dimly discerns that, while she paused and struggled, a new and a sinister element of uncertainty was beginning to join the others to increase the fluctuation of her mind. At all times she kept her eyes and her ears open. Her sense of the drifts of feeling and opinion was extremely shrewd, and there were many about her who were ready enough to tell unpleasant stories of the absent favourite and expatiate on his growing, his extraordinary popularity all over the country. One day a copy of the letter to Egerton was put into her hand. She read it, and her heart sank. She scrupulously concealed her feelings, but she could no longer hide from herself that the preoccupation which had now come to wind itself among the rest that perturbed her spirit was one of alarm. If that was his state of mind, if that was his position in the country, she did not like it at all. The lion-hearted heroine of tradition would not have hesitated in such circumstances, would have cleared up the situation in one bold and final stroke, but that was very far indeed from being Elizabeth's way. Pusillanimity, the Spanish ambassadors had reported, a crude diagnosis. What really actuated her in the face of peril or hostility was an innate predisposition to hedge. If there was indeed danger in the direction of Wanstead, she would not go out to meet it. Oh, no! She would propitiate it. She would lull it into unconsciousness. She would put it off and put it off. That was her instinct. And yet, in the contradictory convolutions of her character, another and completely opposite propensity may be perceived, which, nevertheless, such is the strange mechanism of the human soul, helped to produce the same result. Deep in the recesses of her being, a terrific courage possessed her. She balanced, and if one day she was to find that she was exercising her prodigies of agility on a tight-rope over an abyss, so much the better. She knew that she was equal to any situation. All would be well. She relished everything, the diminution of risks and the domination of them, and she would proceed in her extraordinary way with her life's work, which consisted of what? Putting out flames, or playing with fire? She laughed. It was not for her to determine. Thus it happened that when the inevitable reconciliation came, it was not a complete one. The details are hidden from us. We do not know the terms of the peace. We only know that the pretext for it was yet another misfortune in Ireland. Sir Richard Bingham had been sent out to take command of the military operations, and early in October, immediately upon his arrival at Dublin, he died. All was in confusion once more. Essex again offered his services, and this time they were accepted. Soon the Queen and the favourite were as much together as they had ever been. It appeared that the past had been obliterated, and that the Earl, as was his wont, had triumphantly regained his old position as if there had never been a quarrel. In reality, it was not so. The situation was a new one. Mutual confidence had departed. For the first time, each side was holding something back. Essex, whatever his words, his looks, and even his passing moods may have been, had not uprooted from his mind the feelings of injury and defiance that had dictated his letter to Egerton. He had returned to court as unchastened and undecided as ever, blindly impelled by the enticement of power. And Elizabeth on her side had by no means forgotten what had happened. The scene in the council chamber still rankled. She perceived that there was something wrong with these protestations, and while she conversed and flirted as of old, she kept open a weather eye. But these were subtleties it was very difficult to make sure of, as the days whirled along at Whitehall and Greenwich and Nonsuch, and even Francis Bacon could not quite decide what had occurred. Possibly Essex was really again in the ascendant. Possibly, after the death of Burghley, the star of Cecil was declining. It was most unwise to be too sure. For more than a year, gradually moving towards the Cecils, he had kept out of the Earl's way. In repeated letters he had paid his court to the secretary, and his efforts had at last been rewarded in a highly gratifying manner. A new assassination plot had come to light, a new Catholic conspiracy. The suspects had been seized, and Bacon was instructed to assist the government in the unravelling of the mystery. The work suited him very well, for while it provided an excellent opportunity for the display of intelligence, it also brought him into a closer contact with great persons than he had hitherto enjoyed, and it turned out that he was particularly in need of such support. He had been unable to set his finances in order. The mastership of the Rolls and Lady Hatton had both eluded him, and he had been obliged to content himself with the reversion to the clerkship of the Star Chamber, with the prospect, instead of the reality, of emolument. Yet it had seemed for a moment as if the prospect were unexpectedly close at hand. The actual clerk was accused of peculation, and the Lord Keeper Egerton was appointed, with others, to examine into the case. If the clerk were removed, Bacon would succeed to the office. He wrote a secret letter to Egerton. He promised, in that eventuality, to resign the office to Egerton's son, on the understanding that the Lord Keeper on his side would do his best to obtain for him some compensating position. The project failed, for the clerk was not removed, and Bacon did not come into his reversion for 10 years. In the meantime, an alarming poverty stared him in the face. He continued to borrow, from his brother, from his mother, from Mr. Trott, and the situation grew more and more serious. At last, one day, as he was returning from the Tower after an examination of the prisoners concerned in the assassination plot, he was positively arrested for debt. Robert Cecil and Egerton, however, to whom he immediately applied for assistance, were able between them to get him out of his difficulty, and his public duties were not interrupted again. But if the secretary were useful, the Earl might be useful too. Now that he was back at court, it would be well to write to him. "That your lordship," Bacon said, "is in statu quo primo, no man taketh greater gladness than I do, the rather because I assure myself that of your eclipses, as this hath been the longest, it shall be your last. He hoped that, upon this, experience may found more perfect knowledge, and upon knowledge more true consent, and therefore, as bearing unto your lordship, after her majesty, of all public persons the second duty, I could not but signify unto you my affectionate gratulation. So far, so good, but now the clouds of a new tempest were seen to be gathering on the horizon, filling the hearts of the watchers at Whitehall with perplexity and perturbation. It was absolutely necessary that someone should be made Lord Deputy of Ireland. After the shattering scene in the summer, nothing had been done. The question was urgent. Upon its solution so much, so very much, depended. The Queen believed that she had found the right man, Lord Mountjoy. Besides admiring his looks intensely, she had a high opinion of his competence. He was approached on the subject, and it was found that he was willing to go. For a short time it appeared that the matter was happily settled, that Mountjoy was the deus ex machina who would bring peace not only to Ireland but to Whitehall. But again the wind shifted. Essex once more protested against the appointment of one of his own supporters. Mountjoy, he declared, was unfit for the post. He was a scholar rather than a general. It looked as if the fatal round of refusal and recrimination was about to begin all over again. Who, then, Essex was asked, did he propose? Some year before, Bacon had written him a letter of advice precisely on this affair of Ireland. "I think," said the man of policy, "if your lordship lent your reputation in this case, that is, to pretend that you would accept the charge, I think it would help you to settle Tyrone in his seeking accord, and win you a great deal of honour, gratis." There was only one objection, Bacon thought, to this line of conduct. Your lordship is too quick to pass in such cases from dissimulation to verity. We cannot trace all the moves, complicated, concealed, and fevered, that passed at the council table, but it seems probable that Essex, when pressed to name a substitute for Mountjoy, remembered Bacon's advice. He gave it as his opinion, Camden tells us, that into Ireland must be sent some prime man of the nobility which was strong in power, honour, and wealth, in favour with military men, and which had before been general of an army. So as he seemed with the finger to point to himself. The secretary, with his face of gentle conscientiousness, sat silent at the board. What were his thoughts? If the Earl were indeed to go to Ireland, it would be a hazardous decision, but if he himself wished it, perhaps it would be better so. He scrutinized the future, weighing the possibilities with deliberate care. It was conceivable that the Earl, after all, was dissembling, that he understood how dangerous it would be for him to leave England, and was only making a show. But Cecil knew, as well as his cousin, the weak places in that brave character, knew the magnetism of arms and action, knew the tendency to pass from dissimulation to verity. He thought he saw what would happen. "My Lord Mountjoy," he told a confidential correspondent, "is named. But to you in secret I speak of it, not as a secretary, but as a friend, that I think the Earl of Essex shall go lieutenant of the kingdom." He sat writing. We do not know of his other faint, imperceptible movements. We only know that in the council there were some who still pressed for the appointment of Mountjoy, that the Earl's indication of himself was opposed or neglected, and that then the candidature of Sir William Knollys was suddenly revived. Opposition always tended to make Essex lose his head. He grew angry. The The Mountjoy proposal seriously vexed him, and the renewal of Nolly's name was the last straw. He fulminated against such notions, and as he did so, slipped, after what he had himself said, it was an easy and almost inevitable transition, into an assertion of his own claims. Some councillors supported him, declaring that all would be well if the Earl went. The Queen was impressed. Essex had embarked on a heated struggle. He had pitted himself against Knollys and Mountjoy, and he would win. Francis Bacon had prophesied all too truly. The reckless man had indeed passed from dissimulation to verity. Win he did. The Queen, bringing the discussion to a close, announced her decision. Since Essex was convinced that he could pacify Ireland, and since he was so anxious for the office, he should have it. She would make him her Lord Deputy. With long, elated strides and flashing glances he left the room in triumph, and so, with shuffling gait and looks of mild urbanity, did Robert Cecil. It was long before Essex began to realize fully what had happened. The sense of victory, both at the moment and in anticipation, both at home and in Ireland, buoyed him up and carried him forward. "I have beaten Knollys and Mountjoy in the council," he wrote to his friend and follower John Harrington, "and by God I will beat Tyrone in the field, for nothing worthy of Her Majesty's honour hath yet been achieved." Naturally enough, the old story was repeated, and the long, accustomed train of difficulties, disappointments, and delays dragged itself out. Elizabeth chaffed over every detail, changing from day to day the size and nature of the armament that she was fitting out, and disputed fiercely upon the scope of the authority with which the new Lord Deputy was to be invested. As the weeks passed in angry bickering, Essex sank slowly downwards from elation to gloom. Perhaps he had acted unwisely. Regrets attacked him. The future was dark and difficult. What was he heading for? He was overwhelmed by miserable sensations, but it was too late now to draw back, and he must face the inevitable with courage. "Into Ireland I go," he told the young Earl of Southampton, who had become his devoted disciple. "The Queen hath irrevocably decreed it. The Council do passionately urge it, and I am tied in my own reputation to use no tergiversation. And, as it were indecorum to slip collar now, so would it also be minime tutum. For Ireland would be lost, and though it perished by destiny, I should only be accused of it because I saw the fire burn and was called to quench it, but gave no help." He was well aware, he said, of the disadvantages of absence, the opportunities of practising enemies, and the construction of princes, under whom magna fama is more dangerous than mala. He realized and enumerated the difficulties of an Irish campaign. "All these things," he declared, "which I am like to see, I do now foresee." Yet to every objection he did his best to summon up an answer. "Too ill success will be dangerous. Let them fear that who allow excuses, or can be content to overlive their honour. Too great will be envious. I will never forswear virtue for fear of ostracism. The court is the centre, but methinks it is the fairer choice to command armies than humours. These are the very private problems," he concluded, "and nightly disputations which from your lordship, whom I account another myself, I cannot hide." At moments the gloom lifted and hope returned. The Queen smiled. Disagreements vanished. Something like the old happy confidence was in the air once more. On Twelfth Night, 1599, there was a grand party for the Danish ambassador, and the Queen and the Earl danced hand in hand before the assembled court. Visions of that other Twelfth Night, 5 short years before, that apogee of happiness, must have flitted through many memories. 5 short years. What a crowded gulf between then and now! And yet, now as then, those two figures were together in their passion and their mystery, where the viols played their beautiful tunes and the jewels glittered in the torchlight. What was passing? Perhaps in that strange companionship there was delight, as of old, and for the last time. Elizabeth had much to trouble her. Ireland, Essex, the eternal question of war and peace, but she brushed it all aside and sat for hours translating the Ars Poetica into English prose. As for Ireland, she had grown accustomed to that, and Essex, though fretful, seemed only anxious to cut a figure as Lord Deputy. She could ignore those uncomfortable suspicions of a few months ago. There remained the Spanish War, but that too seemed to have solved itself very satisfactorily. It drifted on in complete ambiguity while peace was indefinitely talked of, with no fighting and no expense. A war that was no war, in fact, precisely what was most to her liking. One day, however, she had a shock. A book fell into her hands, a history of Henry IV. She looked at it. There was a Latin dedication to Essex. To the most illustrious and honoured Robert Earl of Essex and you, Earl Marshal of England, Viscount of Hereford and Bourchier, Baron Ferrars of Chartley, Lord Bourchier and Luan. What was all this? She glanced through the volume and found that it contained an elaborate account of the defeat and deposition of Richard II, a subject implying as it did the possibility of the removal of a sovereign from the throne of England, to which she particularly objected. It was true, no doubt, that the Bishop of Carlisle was made to deliver an elaborate speech against the king's deposition, but why bring the matter before the public at all? What could be the purpose of this wretched book? She looked again at the dedication, and as she looked the blood rushed to her head. The tone was one of gross adulation, but that was by no means all. There was a phrase upon which a most disgraceful construction might be put. Most illustrious Earl, with your name adorning the front of our Henry, he may go forth to the public happier and safer. The man would, no doubt, pretend that our Henry referred to the book, but was there not another very possible interpretation? That if Henry IV had possessed the name and titles of Essex, his right to the throne would have been better and more generally recognized? It was treason. She sent for Francis Bacon. "Cannot this man, this John Heywood, be prosecuted for treason?" she asked. "Not, I think, for treason, madam," was the reply, "but for felony." "How so?" "He has stolen so many passages from Tacitus." "I suspect the worst. I shall force the truth from him, the rack." Bacon did what he could to calm her, but she was only partially pacified, and the unfortunate Heywood, though he was spared the rack, was sent to the Tower, where he remained for the rest of the reign. Her suspicions, having flamed up in this unexpected manner, sank down again, and after a slight scene with Essex, she finally signed his appointment as Lord Deputy. He departed at the end of March, passing through the streets of London amid the acclamations of the citizens. In the popular expectation, all would be well in Ireland, now that the Protestant Earl had gone there to put things to rights. But at court there were those whose view of the future was different. Among them was Bacon. He had followed the fluctuations of the Irish appointment with interest and astonishment. Was it really possible that with his eyes open that rash man had fallen into such a trap? When he found that it was indeed the case, and that Essex was actually going, he wrote him a quiet, encouraging letter, giving no expression to his fears or his doubts. There was nothing else to be done. The very intensity of his private conviction made a warning useless and impossible. "I did as plainly see," he afterwards wrote. his overthrow chained, as it were, by destiny to that journey, as it is possible for a man to ground a judgment upon future contingents. 12. The state of affairs in Ireland was not quite so bad as it might have been. After the disaster on the Blackwater, rebellion had sprung up sporadically all over the island. The outlying regions were everywhere in open revolt. But Tyrone had not made the most of his opportunity, had not advanced on Dublin, but had frittered away the months during which he had been left undisturbed by his enemies in idleness and indecision. He was a man who was more proficient in the dilatory arts of negotiation, sly bargaining, prolonged manoeuvring, the judicious making and breaking of promises, than the vigorous activities of war. Of Irish birth and English breeding, half savage and half gentleman, half Catholic and half sceptic, a schemer, a lounger, an adventurer, and a visionary, he had come at last, somehow or other, after years of diffused cunning, to be the leader of a nation and one of the pivots upon which the politics of Europe turned. A quiet life was what he longed for, so he declared, a quiet life free alike from the intolerance of Protestantism and the barbarism of war, and a quiet life, curiously enough, was what in the end he was to be given. But the end was not yet, and in the meantime all was disturbance and uncertainty. It had been impossible for him to assimilate his English earldom with the chieftainship of the O'Neills. His hesitating attempts to be a loyal vassal of the Saxons had yielded to the pressure of local patriotism. He had intrigued and rebelled, he had become the client of Philip of Spain. More than once the English had held him at their mercy, had accepted his submission, and had reinstated him in his honours and his lands. More than once, after trading on their fluctuating policies of severity and moderation, he had treacherously turned against them the power and the influence which their protection had enabled him to acquire. Personal animosities had been added to public feuds. He had seduced the sister of Sir Henry Bagnall, had carried her off and married her in spite of her brother's teeth. She had died in misery, and Sir Henry, advancing with his army to meet the rebel at Blackwater, had been defeated and killed. After such a catastrophe it seemed certain that the only possible issue was an extreme one. This time the English government would admit no compromise, and Tyrone must be finally crushed. But Tyrone's own view was very different. He was averse from extremity. He lingered vaguely in Ulster. The old system of resistance, bargaining, compromise, submission, and reconciliation, which had served him so often, might very well prove useful once again. But one thing was clear. If the English government desired the speedy destruction of Tyrone, it could have chosen no one more anxious to second its purposes than the new Lord Deputy. For Essex, it was obvious an Irish victory was vital. Would he achieve one? Francis Bacon was not the only observer at court to be pessimistic on that subject. A foreboding gloom was in the air. When John Harrington was about to follow his patron to Ireland with a command in the cavalry, he received from his kinsman, Robert Markham, who had an office about the court, a weighty letter of advice and instruction. Harrington was bidden to be most careful in his conduct. There would be spies in the Irish army who would report everything to high-placed ill-wishers at home. "Obey the Lord Deputy in all things," wrote Markham, "but give not your opinion. It may be heard in England." The general situation, Markham thought, was menacing. "Observe," he said, "the man who commandeth, and yet is commanded himself. He goeth not forth to serve the Queen's realm, but to honour his own revenge. If the Lord Deputy," he went on, "performs in the field what he hath promised in the council, all will be well. But, though the Queen hath granted forgiveness for his late demeanour in her presence, we know not what to think hereof. She hath, in all outward semblance, placed confidence in the man who so lately sought other treatment at her hands. We do sometimes think one way, and sometime another. What betideth the Lord Deputy is known to him only who knoweth all. But when a man hath so many showing friends and so many unshowing enemies, who learneth his end below? Sir William Knollys is not well pleased. The Queen is not well pleased. The Lord Deputy may be pleased now, but I sore fear what may happen hereafter. To such warnings, no doubt, Harrington, a gay spark who had translated Ariosto into English verse and written a Rabelaisian panegyric on water-closets, paid no great heed. But in fact they expressed with an exactness that was prophetic the gist of the situation. The expedition was a gamble. If Essex won in Ireland, he won in England too, but the dice were loaded against him. And if he failed, from the very first the signs were unpropitious. The force of 16,000 foot and 1,500 horse, which had been collected for the expedition, was, for an Elizabethan army, a well-equipped and efficient one. But that was the beginning and the end of the Lord Deputy's advantages. His relations with the home government were far from satisfactory. Elizabeth distrusted him, distrusted his capacity, and even, perhaps, his intentions, and the secretary, who now dominated the council, was his rival, if not his enemy. His wishes were constantly thwarted and his decisions overruled. A serious quarrel broke out before he had left England. He had appointed Sir Christopher Blount to be one of his council, and Lord Southampton his general of the horse. Both appointments were cancelled by Elizabeth. Her objections to Sir Christopher are unknown. Possibly she considered his Catholicism a bar to high position in Ireland. But Southampton, who had incurred her supreme displeasure by carrying on an intrigue with Elizabeth Vernon, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and then daring to marry her, Southampton, whom in her fury she had put into prison together with his bride, that Essex should have ventured to name this young reprobate for a high command seemed to her little short of a deliberate impertinence. There was some fierce correspondence, but she held firm, and the two men followed Essex as private friends only, and the Lord Deputy arrived in Dublin, it was April 1599, in a gloomy mood and a fretted temper. He was immediately faced with a strategical question of crucial importance. Should he at once proceed to Ulster and dispose of Tyrone, or should he first suppress the smouldering disaffection in the other parts of the island? The English council in Dublin recommended the latter course, and Essex agreed with them. It would be easier, he thought, to deal with the main forces of the rebellion when its subsidiary supports had been demolished. Possibly he was right, but the decision implied a swift and determined execution. To waste too much time and too much energy on minor operations would be worse than useless. That was obvious, and the subduing of a few recalcitrant chiefs with a powerful English army seemed a simple enough affair. Essex marched into Leinster, confident that nothing could resist him, and nothing could. But he was encountered by something more dangerous than resistance, by the soft, insidious, undermining atmosphere of that paradoxical country which, a quarter of a century earlier, had brought his father to despair and death. The strange air engulfed him. The strange land, charming, savage, mythical, lured him on with indulgent ease. He moved, triumphant, through a new, peculiar universe of the unimagined and the unreal. Who or what were these people, with their mantles and their nakedness, their long locks of hair hanging over their faces, their wild battle cries and gruesome wailings, their kerns and their gallows-glass, their jesters and their bards? Who were their ancestors? Scythians, or Spaniards, or Gauls? What state of society was this, where chiefs jostled with gypsies, where ragged women lay all day long laughing in the hedgerows, where ragged men gambled away among each other their very rags, their very forelocks, the very parts more precious still, where wizards flew on whirlwinds and rats were rhymed into dissolution? All was vague, contradictory, and unaccountable, and the Lord Deputy, advancing further and further into the green wilderness, began, like so many others before and after him, to catch the surrounding infection, to lose the solid sense of things, and to grow confused over what was fancy and what was fact. His conquering army was welcomed everywhere by the English settlers. The towns threw open their gates to him, and he was harangued in Latin by delighted mayors. He passed from Leinster into Munster, still victorious. But time was slipping away. Days and days were spent over the reduction of unimportant castles. Essex had never shown any military genius, only a military taste, and his taste was gratified now as it had never been before by successful skirmishes, romantic escapades, noble gestures, and personal glory. The cost was serious. He had lost sight of his main purpose in a tangle of insignificant incidents, and while he was playing with time, his strength was dwindling. Under the combined influences of casualties, desertions, disease, and the garrisoning of distant outposts, his army was melting away. At last, in July, he found himself back in Dublin, having spent nearly 3 months in dubious operations far from the real force of the enemy, and with the numbers of the men under his command diminished by 1/2. Then the mist of illusion melted, and he was faced with the deplorable truth. At this late hour, with his weakened army, was it possible any longer to make sure of crushing Tyrone? In extreme agitation he counted up the chances and knew not which way to turn. Wherever he looked, a gulf seemed to open at his feet. If he failed against Tyrone, how fatal! If he did nothing, what a derision! Unable to bring himself to admit that he had muddled away his opportunity, he sought relief in random rage and wild accusations, in fits of miserable despair and passionate letters to Elizabeth. A detachment of some hundreds of men had shown cowardice in the field. He cashiered and imprisoned all the officers, he executed a lieutenant, and he had every 10th man in the rank and file put to death. He fell ill, and death seemed to come near to him too. He would welcome it. He rose from his couch to write a long letter to the Queen of exposition and expostulation. But why do I talk of victory or success? Is it not known that from England I receive nothing but discomfort and soul's wounds? Is it not spoken in the army that your Majesty's favour is diverted from me, and that already you do bode ill both to me and it? Is it not lamented of your Majesty's faithfullest subjects, both there and here, that a Cobham or a Raleigh, I will forbear others for their places' sakes, should have such credit and favour with your Majesty when they wish the ill success of your Majesty's most important action? Let me honestly and zealously end a wearisome life. Let others live in deceitful and inconstant pleasures. Let me bear the brunt and die meritoriously. Till then, I protest before God and his angels, I am a true votary, that is sequestered from all things but my duty and my charge. This is the hand of him that did live your dearest, and will die your Majesty's faithfullest servant. There was a sudden rising in Connaught which had to be put down. The rebels were defeated by Sir Christopher Blount, but by now July was over, and the Lord Deputy was still in Dublin. Meanwhile, at home, as time flowed by, and no news of any decisive action came from Ireland, men's minds were divided between doubt and expectation. At court the tone was cynical. "Men marvel," a gossip wrote on August the 1st. "Essex hath done so little. He tarries yet at Dublin." the decimation of the soldiers was not greatly liked, and when the news came that the Lord Deputy had used the powers specially given him by the Queen to make no fewer than 59 knights, there was much laughter and shrugging of shoulders,